Your main light is the predominant source of light for your subject. It's the light that defines one of the 5 lighting patterns we've previously covered. You'll add other lights to your setup to help reduce contrast or separate the subject from her background, or create some other added effect, but you'll always start with the main light. We've already discussed how to use a single main light to create a simple portrait, and depending on the type of portrait you're making and the way conditions in the room affect your light, sometimes all you need is one light for great results. But to get more control over things like contrast and being able to more clearly define the subject or other elements in the scene, you can definitely make good use of a second light. There are 3 main ways I like to use a second light in my setups. I might use a second light for fill lighting, or for rim or kicker lighting, or I might use a second light for background lighting. If you'll recall, I talked about using a second light as a fill light for the shadow side of your subject. When the main light is on one side, we can use a foam core panel or some other type of reflector to bounce some of that light back onto the shadow side of the subject to reduce contrast. But we might have more control over our fill light if we use a light that we can adjust and modify. In other words, instead of using reflected light, we use another real light source. Another good use for a second light, and possibly my favorite, is to provide a kicker to give the subject a slick outline and separate her from the background. This gives us a more 3-dimensional look, and it's actually very easy to accomplish. Some call this a cross lighting setup because we're basically pointing 2 lights at each other on opposite sides of the subject. Finally, we can use a second light to help define our background. So there you have it. 3 uses for a second light that can add some sophistication to our portraits, giving us a lot of great options without adding a lot of complexity. In our next section, we'll get into the details of power settings and placement options for multi-light setups. Moving from a 2-light to a 3-light setup is as simple as adding another light. Of course, when you've only got 2 lights to work with, you have to decide what role your secondary light is going to take. Are you going to use it as a fill light, a kicker, or a background light? But if you've got a 3rd light to work with, you can have separate fill and hair lights, or use one of your extra lights as a rim light and the other as a background light. More lights means more options, but we don't want to overcomplicate our lighting setups, so we're going to look at what we can accomplish with just 3 lights. First, let's build up a basic 3-point lighting setup. This is a great way to produce traditional portraits and headshots. First, we start with our main light, sometimes called the key light. Now, you already know this is the most important light defining our subject. We place this light at about the 45-45 position and make sure that it and our camera settings are giving us a proper exposure. Next, we place a fill light. This can be placed on the other side of the camera, opposite the main light, and directed toward the shadow side of the subject. The fill light can be positioned a little lower than the main, and we usually want a lower power setting on this light. Remember that we're usually not trying to eliminate the shadows on the face, we're just trying to lower the contrast. In other words, we still want defined shadows from the main light to show up, but we want a softer or wider transition from light to dark in the shadow areas. This means that our fill light might only be half as strong as our main light, where exposure is concerned. This would be a ratio of 2:1, for example, where the main light is twice as strong as the fill. Ratios can be a great tool when you're trying to maintain consistency in your portraits from shoot to shoot, and ratios are a good way to communicate specific lighting details. With manual flash, you'll have to use a flash meter if you want to accurately determine lighting ratios. Otherwise, you can skip thinking about ratios altogether and just set up your lighting for your portraits by sight and experience. For example, I might place my main light to one side of my subject, take a test shot to make sure I've got a good exposure, then place my fill light at about the same distance to my subject as the main and set it to about 1/4 or 1/2 power of the main light. Take another test shot, adjust the fill light, and take more test shots if necessary until I like the way it all looks. Finally, we place a hair light and again take test shots and adjust the power as needed. Hair lights can generally be brighter or hotter than the main light because we're usually looking for a bright highlight in the hair. So depending on the subject's hair color, the modifier used on the hair light, and the distance between the hair light and the subject, we might start with a power setting that is twice as strong as the main light. Take a test shot and dial that light's power up or down to your preference. So that's the basic 3-point lighting scenario. Of course, there are other ways to use the 3 lights in your setup. For example, if your main light is being used to create the butterfly lighting pattern, you might not need a fill light at all. So you might want to use a second light as a hair light and the third light as a background accent light. There are lots of ways to go as you add more lights and as you explore other lighting patterns. We'll talk about some of the other ways we can use multiple lights next. So we've covered some of the basic 2 and 3 light setups commonly used for standard portraits and headshots. But there are a few other studio lighting setups I'd like to go over with you. Now keep in mind that you'll never really need more than 2 or 3 lights for most portraiture. If you do add more lights than that, it's probably going to be for some specialized look or effect. Now with that said, let's go over some of the useful things you can do when working with more than one light. Clamshell lighting is a popular setup where you center one light above your subject's face and either a reflector or another light below the subject's face. This setup basically turns a standard main and fill lighting setup on its side. It's got a commercial or a glamorous feel to it, and it creates a very even light coverage that's great for minimizing details in the skin. If you place more lights or reflectors to the sides of your subject, you'll really flatten out the details and texture. And this is something that we often see with beauty pageant headshots. To create the classic clamshell look, the main light, which can be modified with a shoot-through umbrella or a softbox, is positioned above and to the front of the subject as if the intention was to create a butterfly lighting pattern. But it can be placed a little lower too. The fill light is positioned below the subject and angled up toward her. This lower light can be identical to the top light, modifier and all, but it doesn't have to be. Even a simple reflector can work. Of course, using a light with variable output control is going to give you more options. To create a good clamshell lighting portrait, start with the top light, get a good exposure with that, then add the bottom light. First try that bottom light at about 1/2 the power of the top main light. Take a test shot and adjust to your liking. The one thing to watch out for with clamshell lighting is the lighting ratio. You don't want the lower light to overpower the main light. Another good use for multiple lights is to create a clean white background for your portrait. And there are lots of ways to create a shot with a completely white background, and you can even fake it in Photoshop. But one really good way to get a nice, believable white background shot is like this. First, make sure there's a good distance between your subject and the white or light colored background you'll be using. Next, make sure you have the subject and main light properly set up. Now at this point, we're only concerned with a good exposure for your subject. We consider the background as a separate element where lighting and exposure are concerned. With the subject lighting and exposure set, we now move on to the background. Place 2 lights on either side of the subject and a little behind her so that they light up the background evenly. You might want to use some type of flag on each side to prevent any bright light from spilling onto the subject, especially if you're not using softboxes for those background lights. You can basically blast the background with light to the point where you blow out the detail, and you don't necessarily have to go that far. For example, if you don't want your background completely white, but maybe just an off-white, you can dial the lights down a bit. And one of the reasons we wanted to flag the background lights in the previous example was so that we could avoid flare and light spill. But sometimes you want to use these things to create a special effect, like wraparound lighting for example. Here's how that can look when you don't flag your lights. Another way to produce a more ethereal look is to use your lighting as the background for the shot. Instead of pointing your lights toward the background, you might try pointing the lights toward the camera like this. Next, we'll go over other background lighting techniques that can add the finishing touch to your portraits. We've touched on how our main light and additional lighting can affect the visibility of the background in our portraits. The background is something that should be considered in our portraits. After all, it's in the frame and so it's part of the picture. And it plays a supporting role to your main subject. The background might be a good view of the environment or just a blur of color and tone, but how you choose to use your background is going to affect the overall look and feel of the portrait or headshot you're trying to create. Things like your depth of field and subject to background distance are also going to have a big effect on what the background looks like in your shots. As far as the lighting goes, there are times when the background seems to just take care of itself. For example, if your subject is sitting or standing just a couple of feet from your backdrop, the light spilling off your main light may be all you need to get a pleasing look to your background. If you've got a little more distance between your subject and the backdrop, you can get creative and use another light, one dedicated to the background, to throw a spot of light or even an interesting pattern of light onto the background. And this can be an effective way to enhance a headshot portrait if you do it right. And your light doesn't have to be white. You can also change the look of the background by adding color. And we can do this with colored gels. I like to think of deliberate background lighting as separate from the rest of the lighting setup. I treat the background as its own subject with its own lighting, and you can light a backdrop or a part of the environment serving as the background in all sorts of ways, including with gels and ambient light sources. With most lighting setups, additional lighting creates more complexity, but if you think of the subject lighting as separate from the background lighting, it can make things much easier. Like I've said in a previous video, you might want to determine your light and camera settings for the subject first, then move on to setting up your background lighting. If you've got your subject lighting set correctly, all you need to do is adjust the output of the background lights to match your working camera settings. No need to keep readjusting the lighting on the subject or the settings on your camera. It's important to consider light spill. If you don't want the light meant for your subject to affect the background or vice versa, you have to take steps to prevent that from happening.